Well, here with some of their takes on the big stories of the day we'll be covering throughout the day here on Sky News. Tanya Breyer and Kevin Adams are back. And we're going to start with new measures unveiled today regarding the prison system. Hundreds more prison guards are to be hired to help tackling rising violence in jails. We're also hearing that inmates will be facing drug tests when they go into prison and also when they leave prison. Joining us from our Westminster studios, the Justice Secretary Liz Truss, who will be announcing these measures a little later on today. Good morning to you, Ms. Truss. Thank you very much for speaking to us here on Sky News. I just want to put to you something that Steve Gillam from the Prison Officers Union said yesterday publicly. He said that the union was willing to take strike action, which is illegal. In fact, they'd be willing to go to prison because they feel so bad about how the prison system is being run at the moment. They'd rather go to prison in those current conditions themselves. He was saying that prisoners and staff are at risk if something isn't done. The measures you're announcing today, how far do you think you are going to reach their demands?
Well, there are serious issues with violence in our prison system. I'm clear this is unacceptable. I want prison officers to have a safe place to work, but I also want safe prisons where the offenders can be reformed, because we know there's a huge cost to society of reoffending, £15 billion a year, and we need to make sure prisoners get off drugs, they get a job on release, that they get the education they may not have. So that's why we are putting in additional officers, but we're also boosting security measures on drugs, drones and phones to improve safety in our prisons.
You're funding an extra 2,500 frontline prison officers. Do you think that's enough? How much of a mess have you inherited?
Well, I've been talking to governors and officers on the ground. We've looked at the evidence. And what this number of officers will enable us to do is have a dedicated officer for every 6 prisoners. So they will be able to challenge those prisoners, but also support them in terms of them turning their lives around. And that will keep our prisons safer. But this is not just about staffing, it's also about how our prisons are run and managed. And what I'm doing is giving our governors more power, but also holding them to account on how much progress a prisoner is making in terms of their education, getting into work, getting off drugs. That's an important part of the reforms as well.
And well, the prison population has continued to rise, while officer numbers has fallen by 28% since government cuts came in 2010. You're pledging these 2,500 officers, which isn't going to meet that stopgap. And if you look at the statistics the unions are coming out with about the state of the prisons, 65 assaults a day across the system. That's a steep rise on last year. Suicide rate up 13%, 107 prisoners taking their own life last year, and attacks on staff up 43%. When are these new measures going to come in? Because, you know, it probably won't be for another year until these measures are actually put forward and the wheels put in motion. And in that time, I mean, just looking at the suicide rates, you're talking about 100 prisoners that could take their own lives in this time.
So we've already started recruiting for 10 of the most challenging prisons. In terms of new officers. I announced that in October. We've already put in new security measures, so testing for psychoactive substances like spice and mamba, which have had a very severe effect on prisons. They've created more violent behaviour, so we've already done that. And today's announcement adds to that recruitment, widening it across the entire prison estate. And those officers are being recruited and trained now.
You have to wonder, though, why it's got to this stage. It's taken the unions to threaten strike action for you to actually do something about this. I mean, we're just looking at some of the feedback we're getting on social media. A lot of people are saying it's too little too late. The horse has already bolted. The prison system is on its knees. It's in complete disarray. You're offering 2,500 new prison officers and drugs test when they go in and out of prison. Drugs testing probably isn't the answer. It's actually the drugs getting into the prison and there not being enough staff to cope with that. The horse has already bolted.
Well, I made this a priority when I was appointed to this job in July, and in my conference speech I talked about new officers in those 10 most challenging prisons. So I've already taken action. It's the first thing I did in this job, and we do have a comprehensive plan which involves cracking down on drones and phones, improving security, yes, testing offenders for drugs on entry and exit, as part of helping to get them off drugs. Because what we know is if somebody stays on drugs while they're in prison and leaves prison, they're very likely to reoffend. And that is a huge cost to society, a £15 billion cost a year. So as well as making our prisons safe, we also need to make sure they're places where people's lives are turned around. So we don't just end up with those people going back into prison after they've committed another crime, causing huge misery to society. Of course, this will take time. But I have already started the recruitment. We've already put in those new security measures. We've already rolled out new tests for those psychoactive substances. I'm not saying this is easy, but I'm absolutely determined to see the violence levels come down and the reoffending rates come down, because it's a huge cost to society. I have immense respect for prison officers. They do a fantastic job, and I want them to have the full support they have on the front line. OK,
so you're tackling violence in prisons and you're tackling drugs. Liz Truss, I just want to put to you, we had a Sky News investigation earlier this week. Our Home Affairs correspondent Mark White found that de-radicalisation programmes in prisons just aren't working. 2 out of 3 convicted terrorists refuse to take part completely and are now back on our streets. 3/4 of the 583 people imprisoned on terror charges in the years since the 9/11 attacks have now served their sentences. They've been released, and many of them still hold exactly the same extremist views as they held when they went in there and were convicted of terrorism. What are you doing to combat that?
Well, it's a very serious issue in our prisons. That's why we're training all prison officers, and that training will be complete by the end of this year in terms of countering extremist narratives. That's why we're also creating separate units for the most subversive individuals, so they're not able to influence other offenders across the system. We are putting that in place. We already deal with those most subversive individuals in that way.
But do they have to opt into these schemes? Because obviously they've got to want to change, to sit there in a de-radicalisation programme and change their views. Some people are just simply not doing it. How does it work?
Well, we have a director of counter-security and terrorism, and she is responsible for making sure that those individuals who are putting across subversive messages, undermining British values, are not able to do it. And those messages must be countered. And in the worst case, those individuals must be separated from the mainstream population.
So if you can't change them, you simply segregate them. It's not really solving the problem, is it, when they go back out onto the streets?
Well, we have some very sophisticated programmes to counter that radicalisation. And there is a certain amount of success. There are, of course, some very difficult cases. But it is the responsibility of the parole board to make sure that that people are ready to leave and are reformed when they leave our prisons, so the public are safe.
All right, and Liz Truss, Justice Secretary, thank you very much for speaking to us
Thank
here
you.
On Sunrise on Sky News. Kevin and Tanya were listening to that. Kevin? You're making some faces as we were having that discussion.
I just find
it all of issue.
Yes, I was taking issue with the fact that, Liz Truss has inherited a system since 2010 that's not good. I'm not putting
all on... Cutbacks came in.
That's right, 28%, as you've said. But to say you're going to test people for drugs as they go in and out is not going to solve the problem. And to say you're going to try and weed out drugs when we know these people are on drugs when they enter a prison and they remain on drugs while they're in there. When you ask her the question, Liz, is it an opt-in or opt-out system? She didn't answer the question. I cannot stand when you ask a politician a question and they do not answer. It's the political sidestep.
Welcome to our world.
You see, this is what infuriates people, and this is why we're getting the whole Donald Trump thing. He will answer with the first thing that comes into his head, whereas Liz Truss has answered, and it's not really an answer to the question, is it an opt-in or an opt-out, because it's not working. It shouldn't be opt-in or opt-out. The whole point of prison, as you guys say, is for reform. I say it's for punishment, but I'm going with your stance.
So what would you do for the drugs? How would you counteract that? What's your solution, Kevin?
You shouldn't have taken the 28% of the guards out, because for me, if you're found with drugs on there, then it should be you should be in solitary confinement. There should be more of a solitary confinement. For me, when you look at people in prison, we talk about prisoners' rights. There is suicide in prison because there's the prevalence.
But do you believe they should have rights, though?
No.
Okay.
The loss of liberty. Someone tweeted me and said, Kevin, prison is not for punishment, it's for rehabilitation, and the punishment is loss of liberty.
But then should they be punished when they're in there, in terms of that is the punishment, they're going into prison? Once they're in there, should they be treated as a human being and be given the chance to rehabilitate, to atone for their sins, if you like?
No.
Okay.
Well,
If you're going to,
But why
if you're going
not?
into prison,
But why not?
Why not?
Because given them what, so you're literally just locking the key, that's it. And then, of course, that creates the violence, that creates the suicide.
It's not going to help them when they get out.
No,
we're
they
doing
just
it.
push them in
We're doing it
and
your
not doing
way.
anything
We're doing
with
it
them.
your way now. It's not working.
but if you go into prison as a drug addict
Yes.
and you can get access to drugs while you're in prison,
Yes.
And you're being punished for a separate crime, maybe fueled by your addiction, you need help to get off drugs, don't
Exactly.
you? In prison.
So why
And
wouldn't you get
clearly
that
isn't-
help?
No, I'm saying no. I'm not saying not give them help. I'm saying when you go to prison, you go to prison as a punishment. Loss of liberty is not a punishment. I know plenty of people that are living right now that have lost their liberty, and so for me, the two don't equate.
Can I just say, we haven't even addressed the fact of how the drugs get into the prison in the first place. We're talking about it as if people go into prison and they've readily got access to drugs.
We're talking exactly as Liz Truss just spoke about it just then. She sidestepped the issue, and that for me is a problem. And then when you actually pushed her on a point which was great, she started to because you have no answers. She has no answers.
Well, because the de-radicalisation programme, as Sky News investigation shows, just isn't working. The stats are there. People are going in with one view, coming out with the same view.
Because it's an
That's hard to change their view in the environment.
But if it's an opt-in and opt-out system, then it's going to be hard to change a view. It should be you have to attend the programme.
I mean, the other big problem is who on earth would want to work in a prison nowadays? You know, when you read about how hellish it can be inside, and you have the union also describing how it's hell on earth inside these prisons.
They're calling it a bloodbath, and that one of their staff might die.
Yeah, I mean, it's not going to help recruitment, is it?
No, not at all. And the fact that the unions had to be the one to point out how bad it was, that shouldn't have happened.
It won't help. Recruitment will be there, but it's the kind of people that will be applying for the job that we need to question. We had 28% of people that are actually good at their job, and we got rid of them in 2010, and now we're going to put in substandard people that really, we have to question why you'd want to go into a job like that.
People without the experience.
Yes,
they need the experience. Kevin, I agree with you that, of course, it's your loss of liberty, you need the punishment, you're in prison for a reason, but it just, I suppose it depends on the crime, and to give people the chance to rehabilitate into society.
at the latter part of their sentence.
Well, it's been a feisty debate. It's just a taste of things to come. We will be debating this issue again at 9:30. Join us for that. Tweet us your views at Sky Sarah Jane, at Jonathan Samuels. You can get in touch via email as well, news@sky.com. Still to come here on Sunrise.
Our aim must be to improve the status of women and not just